Johnathan Flowers. I'm on the organizing committee of Theorizing the Web, and I'm really excited for this next panel. Our panelists are Olga Boichak and Jackie Orr. Olga is a PhD candidate at Syracuse University, and Jackie Orr is a performance theorist and associate professor in sociology at Syracuse University, and they're presenting their project, Justice Matters, Racializing Data Colonialism. We have Joshua Weiss and Danny Spitzberg. Josh is a PhD student at UC Davis in cultural anthropology and science technology studies. And Danny is a sociologist and user researcher based in Oakland, California. And they're going to be presenting their talk, Slow Internet in Cuba and an Unexpected History of Socialized Technology. And finally, we have Yoehan Oh, who's a PhD student in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Polytechnic Institute, and his presentation is Walled Garden Wide Web, a land-based settler colonialist approach to non-English web and search. So I'm going pretty fast with the introduction so that they have the maximum amount of time to give some wonderful presentations. So let's give a round of applause to Olga and Dr. Orr.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flowers, for introducing us, and thank you so much for being here and for having us here. So our project, Justice Matters, emerged at the intersection of sociology and media studies, and in this project we would like to investigate the implications of data colonialism on race and also on social justice. So first I will explain the concept of data colonialism and set the stage for our argument, and then I will turn it over to Jackie, who will focus on data justice and what decolonizing data might look like in terms of concrete methods. So let us start with data colonialism. We're drawing from Coldry and Mejia's, in whose explanation data colonialism is this emerging set of structures and processes that appropriate digital data to serve the ends of a capitalist mode of production. And so pervasive datafied representations of every facet of human existence that are combined with the rapid technological advancement in data storage and also in computing enable new forms of subjectivity that are located outside of human body, but nonetheless they allow to manipulate human behavior at an unprecedented scale. And so scores of behavioral as well as biometric data have come to construct and represent the contemporary subject in what John Cheney-Lippold calls the measurable type. It's a template of a datafied performance of identity that is constructed by predictive algorithms. And so according to Coldry and Mejia's, this data industrial complex that is fueled by the extraction and commodification of seemingly naturally occurring resources, and digital data is discursively constructed as a naturally occurring resource that is just there, leads to a full capitalization of human life at an unprecedented scale. And so Coldry and Mejia suggest that these predatory data extraction and commodification practices can best be understood in the context of historical colonialism. They argue that conceptualizing data as a naturally occurring resource that's there to claim allows for appropriation of data that emerges in the process of human interaction in these fully mediatized environments. And so in this way, datafication serves the interests of a capitalist mode of production. At the same time, as we know from Safiya Noble, from the intersectional power analysis that she performed, in which she demonstrates that racism is being made profitable under this capitalist mode of production, which further marginalizes vulnerable populations, and this time it happens on a global scale. And so Safiya Noble draws examples of the instances of misrepresentation of Black women by search engines, but also these examples go much deeper, as well as, for instance, algorithmic bias in decision-making systems, such as the Compass sentencing system, in which Black defendants were disproportionately more likely to be recommended a harsher prison sentence. And so in the framework of data colonialism, the contemporary subject is constructed as one that has little agency to know how they're being perceived by the algorithm, which also affects their ability to intervene in their datafied representations. And in this presentation, we seek to further develop an understanding of a contemporary subject that is not only datafied, but also racialized. And so the idea of raw data, right, this is a popular vernacular in which Moses was the first person with a tablet who downloaded the data from the cloud. We attributed, it's difficult to find attribution to it. You can buy t-shirts with it and things like that. We attributed to a Twitter user, Khalil Senhui, who posted about it on Twitter. And so we argue that Moses was not only the first person with a tablet who downloaded data from the cloud, but also the only person, because otherwise data is a socio-technical assemblage, it is a social construct, and there are many decisions. It is shaped and governed by many decisions that serve in the interests of power at every step of its creation. And so data plays a central role in modern statecraft, but it is also used for what critical race scholar Rua Benjamin calls racecraft, which draws attention to the transition of race from a social construct to a datafied construct that also serves to obscure these inequalities. And in this context, data serve to reinforce the hegemonic forms of whiteness, as we can see specifically through the new opportunities for DNA editing to preserve some desirable social traits, which are also associated with whiteness. And so we present race as a datafied construct, and we say that colonialism is a racist socioeconomic formation, essentially, that is predicated on the idea of expropriating naturally occurring human labor that was largely performed by non-white bodies to serve the interests of the metropolis. And so our project seeks to situate race and social inequality within the present-day data colonialism. Looking beyond the outcomes of algorithmic governance, we focus on the processes of production, collection, and curation of digital data that is performed by precarious workers in various parts of the world in the interests of capitalist mode of production. And so, for instance, teenagers in rural China and single mothers in Kenyan slums spend their days labeling images to help train AI models. There's known instances of Chinese interpreters who work inside of an automated interpretation service, or content moderators in the Philippines or India that are forced to binge watch violent and offensive content to make digital platforms this clean and civil experience that all of us have. And so these activities highlight a deeply racialized pattern of digital labor that institutionalizes inequalities on a global scale through the production of data. And so presenting this online sphere as a source of an opportunity for those who are oppressed and marginalized thus serves to conceal both the historically unequal access to digital resources, but also the exploitation of people in precarious position of those who make this data. And at the same time, as Nancy Ettlinger contends, digital environment affords new opportunities for productive resistance. And so Nancy argues that in favor of recognizing the possibilities of using the affordances of mediatized environments as epistemological vehicles and tools, with which communities can challenge the algorithmically derived norms or representations of themselves that happens not through avoidance or obfuscation, but through producing software, metadata, platforms, and collectives to subvert the repressive technologies of capitalist power. And so our central argument is that the contemporary subject, the contemporary data subject, does not exist. That data colonialism is organized around this theory of the contemporary subject, but reframing of data colonialism makes clear that the contemporary subject there is no single contemporary subject, which is assumed by data colonialism. And because there are numerous divides that shape the subject's relation to colonialism through the production and expropriation of data, we draw on Nancy Ettlinger's work in recognizing the possibilities for multiple subjectivities that emerge in the process of datification and that help unsettle these universalist assumptions of dominance and foreground the agencies that emerge in the mediatized environments.
In Southern theory, Raewyn Connell writes, the general idea of dispossession, one of the most important and under-theorized concepts in social science, needs to sink roots into the mud of particular landscapes. This suggests what we might call dirty theory, that is, theorizing that is mixed up with specific situations. The goal of dirty theory is not to classify from the outside, but to illuminate a situation in its concreteness, end quote. I want to offer some very preliminary dirty theorizing about data justice, with attention to concrete sites outside of or outsiders within a global north and its forms of digital and theoretical dominance. Situated south of global north conceptions of data colonialism, Segura and Weiss board in 2019 foreground Latin America-based practices of data rights activism in a region where 54% of the population use the internet and 45% of households have internet access. Here, that is, there, data rights activism includes improving digital access to public information and protecting civil rights on the internet, including data privacy and the right to be forgotten. Not every population is equally attractive to capital, Segura and Weiss board note, and the datafication and digital subsumption of social groups in Latin America is wildly uneven across specific racial, ethnic, urban, rural, and class divides. Segura and Weiss board question data colonialism as a theoretical framework, suggesting that the analogy with colonialism ignores the radical dispossession and violence of historical colonialism. For example, in a parallel that Couldry and Mejias make in their data colonialism article, between colonized data subjects today signing on to obscure terms of service agreements and colonized indigenous subjects in the expanding Spanish Empire being publicly read in a language they don't speak, the Spanish requirement of 1513, a proclamation describing the legal and divine rationale for imperial conquest and colonial subjection. They're suggesting that the terms of service doesn't really do anything at all like that. Really not. From Australia, Dirty Theorizing of Data Injustices insists that historically marginalized and minoritized groups, people of color, refugees and asylum seekers, welfare recipients, indigenous communities, and the overlaps between those various groups experience a kind of double data colonialism. First, through commodification and dispossession of their data, then, secondly, through more traditional colonial practices that target very specific populations for data surveillance or digital labor exploitation. From the grounds of Chemical Valley, a 15-mile-wide area in Ontario, Canada, with over 60 oil refineries and chemical plants, data justice takes the dirty form of digitally archiving decades of dispersed data about spills, flares, and emissions from Imperial Oil, the oldest refinery in the region. In a community-led project, the Abjanan First Nation, which has dwelled next to the 150-year-old oil refinery, together with the Environmental Data Justice Lab at University of Toronto, are designing quite innovative data visualization protocols and an interactive website that can link particular on-the-ground, or that try to link particular on-the-ground health effects of First Nation people with specific reports of spills and releases. Data justice here means conducting research that can be useful, accessible to the community, and being in good relation through all levels of the research project, environmental, epistemological, and political. In their widely influential work, article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Tuck and Wang position decolonization as a profoundly unsettling and context-specific struggle. Decolonization struggles are distinct, they say, from other civil and human rights-based social justice projects. They write, decolonization, quote, wants something different than those forms of justice, end quote. Decolonization wants us to reckon with the incommensurability between historical land-based dispossession and other forms of racial or class dispossession. It wants us, from our very different grounded positions in Indigenous history, to be accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and futurity, including the sovereign right to have and make a future. It wants us to go beyond decolonizing the mind or cultivating critical consciousness. Quote, until stolen land is relinquished, critical consciousness does not translate into action that disrupts settler colonialism, end quote. Decolonization wants an elsewhere. Recent struggles for Indigenous data sovereignty approach data as a living tanga, or tongue, of strategic value for Indigenous communities, calling for concrete, local forms of ownership, collection, access to, and possession of information about Indigenous peoples, Both locally based projects and more global campaigns through the United Nations and through more autonomous transnational indigenous organizing are happening under this significant banner of indigenous data sovereignty. Okay, we can say more about that. If you Google Long Island, New York indigenous history, you get 31,700,000 results in 0.67 seconds, including Slow Food USA, Long Island cheese pumpkin, Long Island deploys bird armies to fight ticks. In India, the British hyped potatoes to justify colonialism. Big, dumb, displaced data. How to know our place in the demand and desire to decolonize data, to resist the multiple and racialized dimensions of data colonialism. How to know, as a US white settler, which practices of decolonization are actually transformative and which are metaphors that surf on the trending of decolonizing talk today, talk that can often reassert settler innocence and defer any profound unsettling. No one I know, and nothing I read in a mere 30 minutes of Google searching, had concrete, robust knowledge about what and who was displaced when the Dutch first settled their New Amsterdam on this Long Island. Who was radically dispossessed of their worlds, including their data forms and information aesthetics. There are names, I will mispronounce them, Nyack, Taconis, Shinnecock, Keskakani, Montauk. But white settler erasures are violent, and the settler right to forget has been far more violently embraced than any right to be forgotten. Decolonizing data here on the Long Island would require remembrance and the dirty work of knowing how to be in good relation with where we walk today.
Thank you.
Do you shut it down?
All right. Yeah.
Great.
You guys can.
So there's an ongoing discourse happening in Cuba and elsewhere in the global south regarding access to the internet, and often access to the technological forms and to the familiar, to the economically comfortable in the United States. Some of this thinking here, particularly in conversations around the digital divide, quite rightly critique the ability to participate in the various economies, financial, cultural, etc., along racial, gendered, geographic, bodily, and class categorizations. This talk intends to add some shades of gray to that conversation, using the case of Cuba's internet and prior media iterations to raise questions around access and the context of socialist governance and the ongoing intrusions by the United States. These are photos by Ernesto Oroza, a Cuban design scholar and archivist of the Cuban culture of resolver, a Spanish verb meaning to solve, to fix, or more casually in many Cuban contexts, just to get by. Oroza is a brilliant theoretician, he's a professor, he's a practitioner of resolver as a designer, and in casual conversation he draws from Kant, Spinoza, Marx, and Hegel, and speaking about these objects, actively challenging ongoing philosophical conversations surrounding beauty and necessity. And yet, foreign coverage and interviews of Ernesto and his work foregrounds the gadgets themselves, fetishizing and literally objectifying resilience under scarcity. We want to highlight and probe the charisma that these objects exude to those unfamiliar audiences through outlets like Weiss. A few years ago, there was a very similar attraction and conversation around Jugaad design in India. Another milieu of folks making machines out from scarcity, engineering feats despite material and financial resources. This discourse easily found its way into this pop business lit, where it is not hard to see why. Reverence of individuated success, a fetishization of flourishing despite poverty, a whole host of bootstrapping bullshit that we know flies in the face of the lived socioeconomic realities of life under capitalism. We know that these objects, we show these objects because we think this particular trouble is a good shorthand for the bundle of relations that comes with talking about who and who does not have access to the internet, and what will it mean when they get it. So I'm Josh. I'm an ethnographer of tech cultures in Cuba. I've been doing intermittent fieldwork in Cuba for the better half of the last decade.
And I'm Danny Spitzberg. I'm a user researcher and a sociologist, and I've been organizing around cooperatives and digital platforms since around 2012. And together we've organized multiple trips over the last few years to bring a couple dozen of international tech workers and media producers from many different countries in conversations with some of our Cuban counterparts, and importantly in Cuba. And we went mainly for material solidarity, for skill sharing, and to see what kinds of grassroots collaborations might emerge. I'll share more on some of our organizing and research after we go through a couple of different histories.
So first up, just some basics on the Cuban internet. Access to the internet in Cuba dramatically shifted over the last decade. From a very small fraction of the population up to 2010 using it on a monthly basis, these are folks mostly in government and very specific professions, to over half the population using it on a semi-weekly basis today. This is a photo from 2013 of very specific, not very many of these techs of the state telecom provided access. Bandwidth has shifted dramatically, akin for most of the last 30 years to US dial-up speeds, with access points found mostly at universities and hotels. In the last few years, the Cuban state has opened hundreds of public Wi-Fi spots. Home connections are finally possible in many cities, speeds are approaching the hemispheric median, and phone access and data services up to 4G speeds, though rarely actually functional at the moment, are being rolled out. It is important to note here that income is currently the major barrier now for many in the country, and the dependability of these state-run infrastructures are rightfully the frequent subject of local scorn. Over the last half-decade, alternative modes of information sharing have taken the lion's share of U.S. media coverage, from the thousands sharing from local area networks across cities, the vast sneaker net paquete network that, like those who do any kind of internet research, have likely encountered some mention of in the last 5 years, through which people purchase mostly pirated entertainment via ferried hard drives, to any manner of workaround, echoing that same kind of charismatic resilience we highlighted earlier. Though this time with a sheen, and many would like us to believe, the liberatory potential of data. So it was during these organized trips and my ongoing fieldwork that the tensions we're interested in really came to the fore, an attraction to these heroic workarounds under scarcity, often ignoring the role the US has in creating these very conditions, and the presence of a deeply capitalist impulse in many modes of alternative access in the United States. The paquete, for instance, held up very often in Western press as subversive in some way, yet the paquete is essentially this elaborate scheme of dealers in some way. It could not be more, transparently capitalistic in its nature. So this is only one way of narrating Cuba's technological developments. It's full of charismatic tech, workarounds, but it's not the only way of doing so. It's certainly not any story any of us might look to as radical or revolutionary in the way that many leftists are wont to do with all things Cuba. Now is also perhaps a good time to note the unexpected title of this entire talk is with regards to a U.S. and outside Cuba audience. And it's in response to the way in which the country and its tech becomes narrativized in the United States, and mostly in the English language press. Cubans will quite likely know the healthy chunks of what we're sharing with you today. So rather than fetishizing half-century-old cars and human ferried hard drives incited by the U.S. embargo, we'd like to reiterate that these are quite similar to the erosive devices that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. We aim to highlight some of the potentials latent in Cuba's unique socio-technical arrangements. We argue that a different story would benefit from highlighting in order to understand the non-standard path of the internet in Cuba, one that weaves state-driven community learning centers with often justified paranoia about U.S. hegemonic expressed through technology. To make sense of slow internet in Cuba, we're going to present two histories: a long tradition of Cuban media literacies in the name of the revolution, and another of U.S. interference in Cuban media and political consciousness. So many folks know the story of the Cuban literacy campaign that began in 1961, essentially directly following the revolution. This is a large-scale project at the behest of the revolutionary government in which hundreds, thousands of educators taught nearly half of the population to read. Gaining the ability of access to make sense of media was seen as an essential process. The idea to raise the consciousness of the Cuban proletariat, a huge rural population that had worked mostly giant U.S.-owned plantations like United Fruit Company. Alongside this, a lesser-known media socialization process was also occurring. Roving mobile cinemas took the countryside to screen international films, invoking a sense of solidarity. These were mostly like international films with a strongly leftist, either nationalist or internationalist bent. By 1976, over 3 million Cubans, that's roughly half the country at this point in time, had participated in this program of these roving mobile cinemas throughout the country. In the late 1980s, anticipating a global economy revolving around computerization, Cuba began another large-scale transformation in media literacy. A nationwide network of computer learning centers called Joven Clubs opened across the island, growing from 100 in the first few years to over 600 today, distributed along the spectrum of urban and rural geographies and communities. Building out of these centers was a deeply reflexive and dialogic process, like the literacy and mass media campaigns. The Joven Club's mission statement is profound, contributing and furthering to the socialization and computerization of Cuban society. And the pedagogy, services, resources directly correlating to stated local needs. Sparsely populated and mountainous communities were connected with the knowledge and materials and know-how to network telephone lines. These were a network of fairly autonomous, self-directing learning spaces. The governance is transparent in the intention of these spaces, to steer the means by which the population comes to know and use computers. We take this to be a completely unique exemplar in the landscape of state-mediated relations between public and technological form. As the Soviet Union dissolves, so we're talking late 80s, early 90s here, Cuba loses a major benefactor and enters a deep recession there, known as the Special Period. In a certain harmony with the growth of the Joven Clubs, the Cuban government distributes DIY collected repair manuals. These are compendiums with useful folk knowledge about food, health, and machines. So here we see an apparatus on which to mount weaponry. Right next to it, we see means to draw up large-scale batteries, mostly for use in agricultural settings. By this time, Cuba begins to pull out of the absolute worst of this crisis. So this is about late 90s, early 2000s. The Joven Clubs become less fluid, they become less reflexive in their approach as they're built out now, slowly falling short of the promise of their earlier days. As such, these Joven Clubs are not especially revered by the current generation of tech practitioners. An aging socialist government, much of it in place since the revolution, largely declines any attention or financing or material support to further network the country, leaving the vanguard of technological education to entrenched university spaces and autodidacts.
So from a slow internet to a very fast wrap-up, I'm going to share another history. Alongside the Cuban internet and media history is one of U.S. incursions. You can get a bit of a feel for some of the naivete here with this 2015 Time magazine cover asking, what will change when the Americans arrive? And there's a little Wi-Fi symbol that was a sort of semi-subversive, somewhat pushed campaign. This history begins really painfully uninterestingly, with a sort of we're right, they're wrong narrative coming from the US, and it evolves over time to a very nuanced, very effective interference, one that works on all of us to a degree, as foreign tech workers and researchers. So to see how, let's do a quick trace of the many modes through which the US has engaged with Cuba's internet and media over the last 50 years. Then I'll share a couple of anecdotes to close. So, pamphlets, or the original zine, have been dropped over Cuba ever since the beginning. Dozens and dozens of planes, I'm not even sure how many, dropping hundreds of thousands of flyers, pamphlets, other propaganda saying, essentially, like I said, we're right, you're wrong, be free, and so on. Another famous program, in Cuba at least, is a fully fledged news program called Radio and TV Martí, started by Reagan, or at least advocated for him, and it's a spin-off of Radio Free Europe. That was a CIA-funded project in the Cold War. This is broadcasting right out of southern Florida, and you can see the towers here shooting down to Cuba. This is not, as Josh said, something that's new to most Cubans. There's loads of literature. This is sort of a well-known sort of Michael Moore-esque author who writes about terrorism, basically the internet terrorism in all the different forms that have been coming from the US. There's also folks like Alan Gross who showed up with illegal satellite phone chips and other materials to set up networks. And he was put in jail, and when he came out, he was doing all sorts of speaking about access and other, quote, democracy campaigns. And then, of course, my personal favorite, a fake Twitter that was created by contractors funded by the State Department and USAID. Effectively a free news app handed out in free phones that was going to start as something to share updates, but would be eventually seeded with subversive content to incite some sort of Cuban Arab Spring or smart mob or whatever consultants are pushing these days. And what's most interestingly about working here for this context is this way that we look at Cuban tech workers, at least in part. You have folks who are like the Cuban doctors and really famous diplomatic tokens, very well trained, very capable, sent around the world to do humanitarian work. So too, Cuban engineers are very well educated and highly talented. And in modern US and foreign media, you have articles essentially saying there's a huge untapped labor pool. Just imagine, if we had access, we could outsource work to Cuban tech workers to build our apps or do startup, what have you. Meanwhile, the so-called Google Studio at this art center has opened up basically just a showroom with some Chromebooks and a Google Glass or Google Cardboard or whatever the thing was at the time. Free Wi-Fi with the password in English basically down with the blockade. No repercussions really for showing up here. They offer classes. It's pretty innocuous at the present, but we'll see what that looks like. And overall, there's a very complex mix. You have here Jose Marti, a national Cuban hero, alongside app stickers on the wall of this studio. And it begs the question, how do we make sense of these two histories together? So I'll speed through this, but really we have to ask, what does slow and spotty internet mean? How do we think about access in the Cuban context, and what can we learn here that we can't learn elsewhere? So we'll go through 3 ways to explain this. First, this guy showing up saying, wow, limited access, it's like a digital detox. It's like nice not to have Wi-Fi. And maybe with a little more time spent, it's something more like, well, at least, Cuba hasn't changed it. I still got a chance to see it before Wi-Fi and Airbnb brought all sorts of other people like me with all sorts of ideas. This obviously doesn't really engage much with the economic conditions that we've described. So another deeper thing that we've probably all thought is, well, let's find some problems and fix them. This is a design thinking workshop that was held a few years back from a different group, not ours, that was actually canceled 3 days by the Cuban authorities before it was going to happen and moved to the Dutch embassy because the people who went really wanted to do it. This is a mode of thinking through problems that essentially is a day-to-day look at small concerns like how can we make more access to Que Pa Hoy, which is a cultural events app, or A La Mesa, which is a restaurant sort of search app. I'm going to have to cut real fast through this. It doesn't help folks who've spent years in computer science degrees trying to optimize how to deliver their media hard drives. This individual, for example, was ultimately run out of business by the time that happened, so access for him is a totally different beast. And folks who see in the open source and free tech community that it's essentially el arroz en el arroz con pollo, basically free software is the thing that Cubans really crave. We were visiting with folks for several weeks, and then we decided to come back and create the kind of access in collaboration with them through a 3-day conference that was open for free tech. The sessions engaged strongly through all the different topics, but it was very collaborative in the sense that we were talking real about what it's like. There were folks who were talking about how do we do mutual aid? So this 3rd round of explanation is essentially asking, if we want to show up and learn about access, it's less about how do we help others, and as this impulse that you see in design thinking, and more how do we help one another. The clearest example being a hacker space, so-called, that has itself basically just a workspace to do project work for foreign clients on a fee basis, which is very sharply contrasted to organizers who were doing a very open thing, sharing all their hard drives with the JavaScript libraries and so on, really providing a commons. So I'll close there and say that it's not really about apps for ride sharing or whatever else. We can appreciate the cute objects, but we really do have to think about mutual aid and what it looks like to do international solidarity in this context as another way to understand access. Thank you.
That's fine.
Okay. Hi, I'm happy to have a chat with this awesome audience. My name is Yoehan Oh. A PhD student in the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Science and Technology Studies. Today, I'd like to talk about one aspect of search engine and the web ecosystem, web content production. In the first place, I'll explain the reason why I need to know more about it. Second, I'll introduce my method, analyzing two domestic search engines in South Korea and Czech Republic simultaneously. In the last part, I'll discuss two cases by drawing from an interpretation of Marxist primitive accumulation from the perspective of critique of settler colonialism. This is the PM novel. Also, I was surprised that our first panelist mentioned her, and she's a great thinker about the data colonialism and racialism and the kind of some feminization. And I have same the concerns and the issues. We want search engines results to be fair and equitable because we have become concerned about search engines' influence in shaping collective understanding of our world. One of the major critics of search engine is Shapia Umujanova's book, Algorithms of Oppression. In her Black feminist theorization of web search, she pointed out many problems in the representation of the people of color, especially women of color in racist and sexist manners. In her conclusion, she argued for a public non-commercial search. To quote, "What is needed is a decoupling of advertising and commercial interest from the ability to access high-quality information on the internet." One of the possible ways to decouple these two, she proposed, to visualize two information and to partition them by the sources like these. To quote, "In a visual rainbow of color that symbolized a controlled set of categories, red was pornography, green was business or commerce related, orange was entertainment, and so forth." In this kind of scenario, we could see the entire indexable web and click on the colors we are interested in and go deeply in the shades we want to see. For more equitable and fairer search results to be realized, I believe that we need not just better search engine algorithms and control of interface, but also web documents and contents that can represent our society in non-discriminatory ways. In other words, if the entire indexable web continue to reflect our world in biased manner, the extent to which search engine results get fairer will be limited. Thus, if we want to bias the web search, if we want unbiased web search, we need to know more about how individuals, non-commercial institutions, and organizations, as well as companies, participate in creating web content. And because it would be impossible to navigate the World Wide Web without search engine, we need to understand web content creation in relation to search engine. Then how can we study these aspects of relationship between web content production and search engine? It is no surprise that, in the first place, we would look at the relationship between Google and the English web content creators. It seems natural because almost all countries' people use Google for their web search. Thus, it seems quite typical and universal phenomena to make use of Google. However, it runs the risk of taking granted a lot of social, economical, and cultural contingencies in content creation, which have shaped and have been shaped by the internet, technology companies, and users. Therefore, we need to identify those contingencies that appear inevitable but actually have been co-produced with new media technologies and content creation practices. To study these taken for granted aspects of the relation between search and web document creation, I propose to pay attention to other search engines outside the US. As of 2019, there are 4 non-US search engines used by their own national users, more than or as much as Google. Baidu in China, Yandex in Russia, Naver in South Korea, and Seznam.cz in Czech Republic. The first three search engines have occupied the dominant market share in their national market, and the last one had the most portion of web search traffic until the early or mid-2010s, and now is the second to Google in their domestic market. Therefore, studying the relationship between these non-US search engines and their non-English content producers in those four cases would provide proper opportunities to study much wider, richer, and non-conformist narratives. My attention to these other countries' search engines, except the United States Google, is based on the post-colonial understanding of Eurocentricism. In his book, Provincializing Europe, Dipeshi Chakrabarti problematized the universalism of the nation-state as the most desirable form of political community. To make it short, to provincialize Europe means to decenter liberal political subjects in Western Europe countries as role models, and to de-peripheralize the third world people like peasants in Bengal, India, who are regarded as being transitional status from pre-modern to modern. This understanding implies that if we want to decenter the hegemonic entities, we need to leverage other entities that have been regarded as the peripheral. Among those four local search engine and content creators using the corresponding languages, I prefer South Korean and Czech Republic cases to the Chinese and Russian cases. There are three reasons. First of all, accessibility. As a South Korean native, I am more aware of the South Korean search engine than other ones. Second, it is because the analysis of Chinese and Russian cases would be far politically charged. These cases with troublesome issues. These cases come with troublesome issues like information control by the oppressive state. Even though this is really important, the human rights issues, the expensive consideration might distract us from the studying our intended objectives. The third reason to take South Korea and Czech Republic as our research subject is to aim at making each case to be reference point to each other. This idea is inspired by another post-colonial thinker and inter-Asian culture scholar, Chen Kwan-sing, and his book, Asia's Method. He was originally motivated by a Japanese historian, Mizoguchi Yuzo's book, China's Method. According to Chen, Mizoguchi interpreted that Japanese modern intellectual tradition since Meiji Restoration in 1868 had tried to study Asia as an end through the world as means. But Mizoguchi proposed to reverse this case method relationship and then conceived of the world as an end via China's method or China's means. Extending Mizoguchi's proposition, the Chen argued that Asia can be conceived as method, and that thus Asia's method can be multiplied. To quote, Asia can be a synonym for China, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, or Seoul, Taipei, or Bangalore, or the third world. Moreover, he argued that Asian countries can refer not necessarily to the US but to each other when they try to know themselves. He called this reference to each other, to quote, constant interreferencing and the dialectic of comparison. When you take multiple perspective Chen proposed, South Korean case will be a reference point to study Czech case, and at the same time, Czech case will be a reference point to study South Korean case. At this point, I'd like to say the surprising point is that the second panelist mentioned the Jugad, and Jugad can be kind of some tools to interpret the Cuba's the cases about their kind of some tinkering with their materials at hand. I think we are kind of some very on the same steps, and so this panel is fascinating, the highly coupled and coherent panels. Okay, so I'll take South Korean and Czech search engines and their local web document creation practices as a method to understand the relationship between Google and the English web creation as a case. If we take this methodological approach, then which specific new findings will be discovered? Even though I am still at the very initial stage of this research subject, One of my first impressions is these search engines ambivalence in approach their own technological progress, or kind of some heteroglossia, that is the quality of a text that speaks with many voices at once, many heterogeneous voices at once. For example, one of Naver's official blogs, Naver Search and Tech, has published many so-called tech blog style entries. Typical one of them is kind of the translation of natural language query into keyword query using recurrent neural net. However, in his interview in 2017, the search director Kim Kwang-yeon attributed Naver search competencies not only to search algorithms, but also to exclusive in-house web resources. When an interviewer asked, Naver has obtained a lot of in-house databases. What do you think is pros and cons? What's Naver's strategy in dealing with external websites and social media? He answered, ultimately, Naver is search service powered by in-house databases. From this view, one of the best examples in Naver's advantages can be sort of restaurant review, which cannot be easily found in Google Korea search result. If you want to find vivid reviews, they are likely to choose Naver. However, Google search result shows websites too much, giving dry impressions. In a similar vein, Seznam.cz shows a proud history of its search technology. In its promotion flyer in 2018, it says, Seznam.cz is the only one in Europe to resist the global player Google and has a considerable share of almost half the online search field in Czech. What makes Seznam.cz unique is that, unlike many other local search engines in Europe, it has its own technology for full text searches. As early as in 1997, it launched Compass, its own full text search engine. But this narrative shows just partial trajectory of its technology. According to the Wikipedia, it said the Compass was subsequently replaced by outsourced search service from Empyreum, which was replaced in 2003 with global partners Google and Jigsaw.cz, which was replaced in 2005 with Seznam's own search engine technology, which was replaced in 2009 with Seznam's new full-text search engine that has been running since then. Furthermore, Seznam had not owned its in-house image and video search capabilities until 2015. Before the moment, it has outsourced image search and image search to Swedish search technology company Pick Search, and video search to a Russian search engine Yandex. Instead, one of its fundamental competencies has come from its ownership of more than 20 web portals. The red bar is the Seznam.cz owned portals of top 20 the websites in the Czech Republic. Both cases of Naver and Seznam show that one of the significant factors in their search competencies are their own content that they created or helped create. This unexpected key factor of two search engines invite us to rethink about the relationship between content creation and web search. We have been told that Google's great success over the world is attributed to its technical excellence. When web portal and web directory companies in late 1990s hired human editors to find and organize the web documents, Google tried to automate the way to find better documents to users' queries. Google's reliance on algorithms, 24/7 automated web bots, and computing infrastructures rather than human labor has made the company itself easily scale up its search capability into the world. But in these narratives, we have taken for granted the existence of a huge amount of the web documents. The case of Naver and Seznam demonstrate that web documents are not given, especially for non-English web. For example, Naver has constantly helped create web documents in two ways. On the one hand, by providing users with various web services like blog, forum, and Quora-like Q&A service. On the other, by purchasing the rights to service of the existing encyclopedia and professional knowledge databases in Korea. Based on these in-house databases, Naver has prevented other search engines web crawlers from collecting neighbors' own databases. They just disabled to access to their databases from the web crawlers. This is very kind of contrast to other four search engines outside the US or Google. This walled garden strategy has been successful, leading to neighbors over 70% search market share. This contrast between the abundant web documents in English and the not enough web documents in Korean is resonant with a recent land-based critique to the settler colonialism. So I find I'm really the proper panel in that our first panelist about they are deeply concerned about the settler colonialism. Okay, I'll go fast. Glenn, Sean Coulthard, the reinterpreted the Marxist the primitive accumulation. He argued that Marx emphasized the proletarialization over the dispossession because the Marx to focus the European context. However, the Coulthard emphasized in the First Nations in Canada or other the indigenous people in the colonies. To them, the dispossession was more significant and critical issues in their kind of the process in the primitive accumulation. From this perspective of the land-based critique of settler colonial politics, now we can identify neighbors' ambivalent situation. It has secured the Korean web not to be exploited by foreign search engines. However, it does not necessarily mean that neighbor has managed the Korean web in a respectful, non-dominating, and non-exploitative way. Thus, we have to identify more subtle ways in which the digital political economy in a local scale is working in a layered with digital political economy orders in global scale. It would help us better understand other countries' native people's lives under settler colonial norms, as well as most countries' internet users that have no other options for search without Google. Okay. I have still many things unexamined and untested. I skipped to show examples of interreferencing between the neighbor and Seisnam. Google and English web as case has not been analyzed, and different theoretical foundations need to be triangulated to each other. Nevertheless, I hope that the decentered understanding of the production and navigation of the digital information would bring us new ideas to address our contemporary concerns about digital identities, representation, and self-determination. Thank you.
So if our presenters could come up. It might be back there. There's the one for the Q&A.
I'm going to run it for you. But
So we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. Does anybody have a question to start with?
Can we also just ask for comments?
Or comments? Questions that are more of a comment, which is normally not the way we ask questions. But if no one else has one, I would like to ask the panelists. So much of your presentations engage with local responses to settler colonialism and data. What would a local development of data look like? What would those data networks, those data usages look like in the absence of settler colonialism? Or is that something we can even conceive of given the globalization of the colonialist project? Start with the big question first.
Yeah, that's it. Oh, do I have to do this?
Yes, please use the mic.
Okay. I'm answering as a very distant observer of
the data justice project happening with the Environmental Data Justice Lab and the Ajinam First Nation. It's not happening in the absence of settler colonialism, but it's happening as a very self-conscious alternative data development practice. And it's not engaged with big data per se, which is already, I think, interesting. But some of the more specific things that they are planning to do is develop an app that can be used by First Nation members who live kind of literally in the shadow of imperial oil, and an app that can help track some of the day-to-day health effects that not just individuals but households and particular geographic communities are experiencing, matching it with data that has circulated elsewhere or not circulated at all, matching it with data that has gone to the Canadian Ministry of Environmental something or other, but has not been locally published. So I don't know that that's considered wildly innovative, and that certainly isn't only a practice that could be happening explicitly against white settler dispossession. It is a practice that white settlers could also be using to address other forms of dispossession. But I don't know, that's just a specific, really pretty local attempt at a kind of data protocol and invention.
I mean, one of the kind of very large hypotheticals, and I want to put that right up front of what I'm about to say, of thinking about global tech expansion through Cuba is thinking about things that are the size of states that we might see as sites of resistance, which is not normally part of the conversations. It's normally small spaces that we might be able to somehow conceive of slightly outside, or spaces that we might conceive of as despite of. But there is something in the sort of bungling nature of the way that Cuba has dealt with technology in the last 30 or 35 years, where some of these things represent alternative modes of building out what might be a different type of system that does not rely on the type of big tech that much of what we're sort of reeling is here, right? That's not to say it's a solution, but it's to say there are kernels of difference there that can and should be kind of expounded upon in different ways. And part of the trouble about answering this question is that it's a scalar one, right? Like there's really a hard way to imagine what might come in the face of some of these behemoths that can really match the might of something like Google, right?
Yeah, if I could jump off that question, I guess, if I could thank you. I'm Colin Garvey from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Thank you for the excellent talks. I didn't see the first two, so I can't speak to this. But Cuba and Yoehan, thanks so much. If I understood you correctly, Yoehan, I guess I thought you were saying that Never and the Czech search engine, in a way, do represent something of a resistance. You see in them something of potential resistance to colonial model, and yet in some ways they replicate the practices of Google and the others. But you see something there that's worth looking into as an alternative. And as I understood you at the end, that you're saying maybe the settler colonialist model doesn't quite apply, that you need some more kind of nuanced model of critique. So I'll be interested to see what you develop, but my question would sort of be then, in a ideal scenario, Naver and the Czech search engine, they read your book and decide to embrace this anti-colonialist developmental trajectory. What would you like to see in a national search engine that could resist or provide an alternative sort of vision of modernity?
Well,
Thank you. Actually, thank you for your great question. And that will be one of my the ultimate direction to expand and elaborate the current project. And I think can be some logic of the kind of some intermediary level of logic. So there are some the middle ground or middle levels of the settlers and settler colonialist and the colonized. So there might be some places that can be exploited by somebody, but the somebody can be the colonizers. But in my cases, in neighbor cases, the local search engine can be seen as kind of some local colonizers, so kind of some feudalistic lord in their kind of some domestic territories. So I think I have no definite answer, and one of I feel a little bit sorry that I'm in position that the accomplishment of the settler colonialistic the discourses and theories to see my own cases. So, and sometimes I feel I might exploit their theories, and I do not contribute to kind of some their own lives, kind of some First Nations their lives, or kind of some colonized their actual struggles like that. So, yeah. Actually, I don't have no clear answer currently, but I have to find more subtle and more nuanced the actual practices in my cases. So I have to again make it more generalizable, so it can be applicable to other kind of some settler colonialist discourses like that. Thank you.
Hi everybody, that was a really phenomenal panel. Thank you. My question is for Josh and Danny. Your point that there's an inherent violence to the democratic media subject, particularly the imposition of the democratic media subject, is one that is super well taken. I guess I was taken by your suggestion that interpretations of El Paquete as subversive are wrong-headed somehow. And I just wanted to dig into that a little bit more, because saying that something is subversive kind of implies that you're subversive against something. And I think that a lot of the American media says that they're subversive against, authoritarianism or the state or whatever. So I wonder if you're saying that they're subversive is wrong-headed is a critique that against like valorizing subversion as a thing, or if it's a critique that there are other subversions that should be valorized that might not be against authoritarianism of the state, but might be against something else like imperialism or American influence or whatever.
Sure.
So a tiny point to give some context is looking at objects like Orozco's little fans and other gizmos, or El Paquete as things you can get, misses some of the larger revolutionary engineering that Cuba practices. So in that sense, it may be missing the more exciting stuff. And also, I think was mentioned the way to think about handling media rather than the conveyance, the channel, right? How media is perceived and how it's processed and how the literacy campaigns have set up to handle what's being received through El Paquete. These basically they're hard drives loaded up with movies, sports, wrestling, whatever, and then given out every day, every week. That's maybe the bigger context that we wanted to make visible, which is so often hidden behind the objects.
Yeah, I would just add, there's an important bit here that, there are two framings in which I see the Paquete is held up as subversive in Western media, one of which tends to be this idea that it's somehow pushing up against the goals or wishes of a revolutionary government, which is just not, there's no empirical way to prove that that's true. There's been essentially zero crackdown on the Paquete since it started being this widespread phenomenon. there are, if you go back a couple of decades, there certainly are examples of the Cuban government strongly policing the type of materials available to people, whether it's magazines, films, etc. Right? There's plenty of that. But if we're speaking particularly in the frame of digital media distribution in the last, let's say, 15, 20 years, that has not at all been a focus of the Cuban government, right? So, being held up as an example of something which is pushing back against a Castro government or revolutionary governments just doesn't hold any weight there. And I think in the other way that I see it tends to be in these kind of like, these milieus like a design thinking workshop or the space where people are thinking about other modes of information distribution. And for me, while there might be some other ways of thinking about these things that I don't have access to, my empirical reality of seeing the paquete at work is that there couldn't be a more sort of like, the paquetes are now below $1 each, and they have like hundreds of gigabytes of data on them. They've been distributed to such a degree successfully through people paying other people, paying other people, paying other people. Like it could not be a more like free market item, right? And just doesn't, those two explanations just don't sort of hold weight for me. And I think of much more as it's just this sort of like charismatic trinket that folks like to think of, either alternative networks or something which doesn't fit with their idea of what's happening in Cuba at the moment, to something like that that's being triggered. But it's not subversion.
I'm going to just pick up on that. My name is Ellery. I work with Global Voices, and I've been doing research on technology and independent media communities in Cuba for about 12 years. And in, I guess, the experience that I've sort of seen and journalists that we've worked with and whose coverage we're on, people who are doing independent media work in Cuba face a lot of challenges from the state. And so I guess I just wanted to throw that out there because it's like the paquete is an obsession of the US media, and it's like, of course, people watch TV, everybody likes TV. So what? Like it's the perfect thing to fetishize for Vox or Weiss or whatever. I just don't think it's that important, honestly. But anyway, I guess the reason that I bring up the issue of the challenges that people who are building their own media there face, which are substantial, is that I guess I want to point out, and then I also want to know, what do you guys think, like, what is the value? Because in a lot of my work there, like, I've learned fascinating things and said nothing about them because I just don't know, is it really important for me as basically an editor working with journalists there, but also, researcher kind of. How important is it for me to talk about this stuff at all? Like these, like my colleagues there, they work entirely on hard drives, partly because there's no internet, but also surveillance is a huge reality. So, I don't know, it's just what do you guys think about, and what you're doing? Like you said, you're doing like,
I will say something that,
just how important is it?
That will be purely my own voice, that I know I am co-signing my co-author here, but I am thinking mostly through the damage that I have seen wrought through American foreign policy, through conversations around openness, right? Through ideas of what other countries' media should look like and the actions which are usually justified using rhetoric like that, right? We only have like 12, 15 minutes to talk about the entire landscape of Cuba. Cuba is a deeply complicated ecosystem where we're talking about the ability to spread ideas, right? One of the interesting things about the paquete is that there's nothing that can really explicitly be read as political that's in it, right? Which is through self-censorship, right? It's a business that would like to keep running, so there's nothing necessarily within it that would be critiquing the Cuban government, right? There are, and I've seen them, other sort of much, much smaller and in no way robust sort of packets of data that is legitimately sort of like critiquing the government that is floating around, right? These things do exist. I just want to the pushback that is always, and this sort of dance that comes from talking about Cuba in any public space is always like, what side is he on? Like, is he totally capoing for the Castro government? Is it like, and the truth is that it's deeply complicated, and I have internally a distrust inherently of this idea that open societies and open discourse necessarily even leads to the best governance, right? Which is like not a hugely popular thing to say out loud. I don't think that we're doing it in the United States correctly. I don't necessarily hold up Cuba also as like the other model, but I do think that there's something about the right of a sovereign nation to design its own kind of ideological ecosystem that they are and have struggled always with what that looks like in the face of folks who would not like it to be that way, right? And we can talk for a very long time about the ethics of how these things are carried out, something like that.
I'll take a sort of lateral move and then maybe as a way to invite in some commentary from adjacent spaces by saying Cuban revolutionary values and principles, for the most part, from what we've heard and what I've seen, are still lifted up as worth believing in. It's been slow and shitty progress with regards to food and agriculture and so on. People will say that too. But it's these principles that you can see, from a revolutionary point of view that are like interesting and rare. So to the extent that you can make commentary about what you see for principles, for patterns of thought, that's amazing. It's really rare to think about an internet that is different than, I've heard a great acronym recently, FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google. And yeah, there's something that we can all benefit from just by seeing some of those principles spoken about, even if they're not well executed, even if self-censorship is real, even if goodness, everything else. But yeah, maybe there's something about principles and some of the takeaways that can make space for some other.
So when I think of the kind of comparison between the two internets, the internet that could be in Cuba and the kind of the more traditional internet that we like to think of, both are a socio-technical assemblage. It's just that the social plays a more important role in Cuba. But then right. So that's all. There is a social infrastructure that underpins the connectivity. It's just that it's organized in different ways, and that's kind of fascinates me so that's something that I find really interesting about the Cuban ways to connect differently.
As the two internet systems in Cuba and other kind of some high countries can be compared, I'd like to add one other kind of the extreme cases of the data transfer. Is that some days ago the black hole picture was the revealed to the public, and one of the interesting to me is that the high gigabyte terabyte data was the storage in the server, the data storage, and that the storage was ported to physically to other ends of the globe. So in this way, so data can be traveled the globe, not the fiber cable, but the kind of through the airplane. So in this way, so there are kind of this data network can be different outcomes of the socio-economic and drives. So this kind of the project is highly motivated by the high-income countries, the desire to know the fundamental thing of the universe. So it is highly unlikely to be funded by the low-income countries, or so it can be otherwise, cannot be made impossible. So in this way, specific the digital network or the data network can be possible to realize whose dreams or whose work make more productive. Like that can be might be more the interesting question.
So we have time for one more question.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so recently Google had to disband its, I think, AI Ethic Council. I was wondering about your thoughts on not only colonizing and settling, but kind of those other kinds of colonialization methods.
My only thought, and I think I'm probably less suited to speak to this is that this, as I understand it, was pioneered and pushed this campaign to disband the council by trans tech workers at and around Google, who were taking issue with some executive from the Heritage Foundation that had a track record of basically speaking against and criticizing and not recognizing, disbelieving, generally just insulting trans people. So there's that. And I think that's a form of oppression that we all should be very, very keen to observe and anticipate in tech spaces. And then as for what it symbolizes, tech workers seeing themselves as workers and doing collective action. I know there was a long week of work from some peers in the Bay Area who were talking about this campaign and this petition to go together and approach the higher ups. So there's just that simple aspect of collective action amongst people who see themselves as having a shared, shared fate. So yeah, just to add some color to this, but I'm more than interested to hear what other folks have to say.
Can I just ask
you a question? So this, because I didn't know of this, so the AI ethics panel has been disbanded, and it's not being reassembled.
So this just happened last week.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this just happened last week, but I think this example is every single institution seems to have some kind of ethical body now and development of a council. So there is imperialism of ideas. So I was wondering if the panel has studied this or can elaborate on it.
I haven't.
I have one more funny little joke, which is when we were at a dinner once, this young person who's studying Russian to be a tour guide and bring Russians over from Russia to Cuba was saying, and he was 16 maybe, and he was like really just plucky, and I don't even know how we met him, but we were at this bar together, and offhand he knew full well. I remember somebody mentioned something about anti-capitalism or something like that, and sort of gently, and this guy goes, "Oh, capitalism? Pfft, no, come on, the real enemy is imperialism." Oh, anyway, this is my favorite song, I gotta go. And I think there's something really beautiful about just naming these things and having them as part of our pedagogy and education. Imperialism is, in terms of ideas, in terms of Google setting up a studio, in terms of other forms of believing in openness of free trade of ideas, the marketplace of ideas, wherever that is. That's just some healthy skepticism and a bit of lightheartedness can go a long way. I think I've spoken enough, but I think there's perhaps another critical comment.
Can I?
This will have to be the last comment.
To your questions, original comment is that the artificial intelligence needs kind of some ethical board. Ethical board can be understood as an imperialistic project to govern all of the research and the technology engineering government. I think it is a very critical the understanding, but at the same time, as I heard that there are some critical scholars of the IT and the artificial intelligence are involved in that the ethical board. So somebody's they claim that why did you join them, or why did you detach yourself from Google, and their response is that it is more complicated than it appears. So somebody's have to be involved in more closely to the main players, to the who has power, who can make change. So I think I do not have the the definite answer, but maybe we need to take a different strategy to if we want to make the fundamental change or more enduring change to be realized.
So let's thank our presenters. And I believe we have an hour-long break.